Okay, well, welcome and thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Robin Donaldson and I'm the Chief Operations Officer at Indiana Youth Service Association. And we are happy to have a full house according to the go-to meeting. So I just wanted to cover a couple of housekeeping items. If you have questions, please go ahead and this system mutes everyone as they come in. So you can ask those questions through the chat box, and we have a couple of people who will be monitoring the chat box to make sure that those questions get answered. We'll leave time at the end for folks to unmute themselves so that they can ask those questions directly. And we also are recording this session so that if you are in and you notice that you are not muted, I would ask that you do mute yourself so that we can have good audio quality for the recording. And so I don't have a whole lot of other things to talk about this because this is going to be recorded. We will have this available to folks later on. With that, I'm just going to go ahead and turn this over to our Indiana Trafficking Victims Assistance Program Service Provider Support Director. That's a mouthful, Whitney Nixon. So Whitney, I'm going to turn that over to you.
Okay, thanks, Robin. Good morning, everyone. Robin, you can hear me, yes? Everybody can hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. So thank you all so much for joining us this morning. I'm really excited to see so many people. One thing that I would kind of like to just reiterate, if everyone can just kind of type their name in the chat box, that way we know that you were here. I am going to be trying to kind of focus on the presentation, so I won't be monitoring the chat box, but I would love to be able to see after who all was on the chat. So if you guys could do that. Also, we would really like to use the chat box for any questions, or if something comes up and you think I really want to ask this question, we have a couple of people monitor the chat box. So if you want to ask questions, you can type them into the chat box, and then we can. Oh, if you could also go ahead and mute yourselves. I think everybody's muted, but if you could mute yourselves, that would be really helpful as well. So just use the chat box if you have questions. Something else that I just kind of want to kind of touch base on is the fact that this is a suicide prevention webinar. And so what that means is that we will be talking about some stuff that might be kind of difficult to hear, some things that might be bothersome to folks. It might bring up some kind of emotional reactions. I generally prefer not to do suicide prevention via digital interfaces or webinars, simply because I don't have the ability to see folks, and I don't have the ability to support folks who need to be supported. However, this is a really important topic, especially during this time, and there's no other way to do it right now, so we thought it was important to do it. But I do want to let you know that there are folks on this webinar, myself, Jessica, Robin, who are happy to support you if there is anything during this webinar that is particularly difficult or kind of triggers any discomfort or emotional reaction. So please let us know if this is not something that you feel comfortable putting in the chat box or saying out loud. We certainly understand that, and just please feel free to reach out. My contact information will be at the end. So we just want to make sure that everybody is feeling supported while we are going through some of this information, because I do know that it can be a little emotionally impactful at times. So that being said, what we are going to talk about today specifically is suicide prevention, but the focus is going to be a little bit on kind of this period of time that we have found ourselves in related to the COVID-19 outbreak, pandemic, and how that changes the way that we need to be doing some of the work that we're doing, and just some ideas and thoughts about how we can change the way that we have been traditionally doing some of this work related to suicide prevention, to be able to continue to do good evidence-based practice related to suicide prevention, but doing it while observing the requirements of the stay-at-home order. So, oh, okay. Okay, now my screen won't go. Let's see what's going on. Oh, there we go. Okay, so that being said, I just really kind of want to start with this idea that we're all kind of stressed right now, and this is a challenging time period, not only for the folks that we are working with, not only for the youth that we are providing services to, but this is also a challenging time for us. And so really keeping in mind that so much of what we need to be doing right now, what we can be doing right now, is supporting one another and providing that kind of uplifting idea of hope. Because I think right now, it's difficult maybe to see hope. It's difficult to see what is at the end of the line for us. What is coming? When does this stop? When can we go back to our normal lives? And so if we're feeling that, then the folks that we are working with and the youth that we are providing services to definitely feel that. So really keeping in mind that there is hope and that there is help. And sometimes we provide the hope, and sometimes we seek out the hope and the help. But just keep that in mind as we move forward, that we don't have to have all the answers, because we don't have all the answers. But what we do really want to do is provide hope for those people who are really struggling during this period. So we're going to start with just some basic statistics. I like to share statistics simply because I think sometimes we don't really know how significant suicide is in our country. So right now, everyone is really keeping a very close eye on the data related to COVID-19. And so we are getting tons and tons of numbers thrown at us every day, from the number of people in the country who have been diagnosed as having the virus, the number of people in the country who have died, the number of people in other countries. So we're kind of inundated with numbers right now. So I tell you that only because these statistics related to suicide are a little bit broader. They are not specific to COVID-19, but they are a little bit bigger in terms of this. These are the suicide statistic numbers that we see on a regular basis. These are the numbers that we see all the time. And so just kind of keeping that in mind in terms of how that plays a role in the work that we are doing. Suicide doesn't care how old you are. It doesn't care what race you are, what religion you are, what socioeconomic status you are. Unfortunately, suicide impacts kind of across those lines. It impacts everyone, and we do see every age, race, religion, and social economic status impacted by suicide. So in 2018, you can see that we had in the United States, these are United States numbers. So you can see that in 2018, we had over 48,000 people in the United States who died from suicide. So this number continues to go up. It averages an increase of about 1,000 people per year. So what we're seeing is an increase in suicide deaths in the United States at a rate of about 1,000 additional folks per year. And there's some reasons for that. Some of that is related to simply population growth. Some of that is related to the fact that as a country, we are doing a better job of collecting data and calculating death rates related to suicide. But also some of that is believed to be related to some other factors like mental health accessibility and things like drug use, substance use in the United States, as well as accessibility to what we call lethal means, so things like firearms or prescription pills. So, we continue to see that number increase. And so the hope is that through sharing this information and doing more work related to suicide prevention, that in future years, we'll see that number start to decrease. Also, it is estimated that there are approximately 1.4 million suicide attempts that were made in 2018. So suicide attempts are relatively hard to capture. This data comes from hospitals or medical facilities where an attempt must, by law, be categorized as a suicide attempt. And so anyone who has a suicide attempt that results in significant injury that requires that they get medical attention for that, those numbers are captured. And so we are able to kind of tell based on those numbers how many folks have attempted suicide and received medical care for it. Unfortunately, what we don't have the means to capture very well are those folks that don't receive medical attention for their suicide attempts. So sometimes what will happen is that someone will ingest prescription pills and go to sleep and not expect to wake up the next morning. And so when they do wake up the next morning, they will kind of go on about their life and not receive any kind of medical care for that attempt. So we also have some folks that have what we call aborted or interrupted attempts, where that attempt is kind of stopped either by themselves or by someone else. And so often those attempts don't require any medical care and thus are not captured within the numbers that I am showing you today. So that 1.4 million estimated attempts is actually probably higher. We just don't have a really good way of capturing all of that data. So those numbers, the 48,344 suicide deaths are what we call a count. So that's just a straight count of how many folks in the United States died from suicide in 2018. One of the other ways that you will see suicide-related data being shown is in rates. So one of the things that a count does not account for is any sort of population demographics. That is just a straight number. So what it doesn't tell you is kind of what suicide looks like in a smaller state like Indiana as compared to a much larger state like Texas or California. So in order to do that, we look at rates. And so the rates are always out of 100,000 people. So the national rate for suicide, if you look at all of the states in the United States, you will see that there are 14 people who die from suicide out of every 100,000 people in the United States. So that's a lot. That's a pretty high number of people who die from suicide. Of all of the things that people die from in the United States, suicide is the 10th leading cause of death. And it is the second leading cause of death for youth. So this is going to be kind of 24 and under. So for our youth, kind of 10 to 24, we see that suicide is the second leading cause of death. And I will show you another graph here in just a couple of minutes that kind of outlines that. But if you think about all of the potential causes of death for our youth population, suicide is the second leading cause of death, which tells us that there's a really large concern in relationship to suicide, especially for our youth. So one of the other kind of statistics that I like to share with folks is how many people we lose in the United States to suicide every day. So that number is 132. And it's kind of hard to think about in terms of how many people 132 is. So if you think about if you've ever been on a commercial jetliner, if you've ever been on a big plane, if you think about how many people are on that plane, we are losing that many people to suicide in the United States 2 to 3 times a week. So if that gives you any indication of how many people in the United States are dying from suicide, it is approximately 2 to 3 full-size jetliners full of people who die from suicide every single week in the United States. So I hope that that kind of gives you just a little bit of a better understanding of how many people are dying from suicide. And then also that kind of breaks down to about 1 person every 11 minutes, which, you know, if you think about, you know, how quickly 11 minutes goes by in the United States, we lose about 1 person every 11 minutes. So this is a graph from the CDC, and they put this graph out every year, and it is the 10 leading causes of death for the age ranges. And so you'll see that across the board for most age ranges, from kind of birth 1 to 44 is unintentional injury. So unintentional injury is going to account for head injuries, car accidents, motorcycle accidents, bicycle accidents, any kind of accident, really. And this is also where we're going to see drug overdose deaths as well that are not ruled suicide. So you can see that kind of across the board for folks 1 to 44, unintentional injury, accidents are going to be kind of that leading cause of death. The green boxes that you can see on your screen right now are suicide. So suicide is the second leading cause of death for 10 to 14-year-olds, 15 to 24-year-olds, and 25 to 34-year-olds in the United States. And I think that's really important to kind of think about, because I think often we don't realize how many folks we're losing to suicide, especially those folks who are young and usually very healthy and have their whole lives ahead of them. I would also like to kind of call your attention to the red boxes. So the red boxes are homicide. And so often I think that because of media portrayals, because of the information that we get related to crime, we have this misconception that homicides occur more often than suicides. But as you can see from looking at this graph, in every single category of age, suicide occurs more often than homicide. So when we think about all of the things that we are doing to address homicide, both in our state and in our country, we really also need to be thinking about the fact that suicide occurs more often than homicide. And so what can we do to really address the rates of suicide? So what is going on specifically in the state of Indiana? Well, in the state of Indiana in 2018, we had over 1,000 people who died from suicide. Now, this is in all age ranges, in kind of in all parts of the state, but we saw 1,092 people in the state of Indiana who died in 2018. Our rate in the state of Indiana is 16.36, which means we have 16.36 people who die from suicide out of every 100,000 people in the state of Indiana. And so there are about 6 million people in the state of Indiana. So if you think about kind of what that means in terms of the people who are dying from suicide, right? That's a lot of people. The state of Indiana does have a higher than the national average rate of suicide. So the national average of suicide is 14 people per 100,000, as we previously discussed. And in Indiana, we have a rate of 16.36. So our rate of suicide is more than 2 people per 100,000 over the national average, which means we have more people dying in the state of Indiana by suicide than the national average of deaths by suicide. If we are looking specifically at Indiana youth, we have 1 in 9 of our Indiana high school students who attempted suicide in 2018. This is the second highest rate right? If we look at the number of high school students that the state of Indiana has, this is the second highest rate in the United States. So the state of Indiana has the second highest rate of youth suicide attempts in the country, which means we have lots and lots of young people who are attempting suicide. And again, remember, these are attempts that have been medically coded. So these are attempts where the individual has received some sort of medical or mental health care for that attempt in a hospital setting or some sort of medical setting. So potentially there are attempts that have occurred that we did not capture, that we were not able to determine was an attempt. And then also, we have 1 in 5 of our high school age students who reports that in the last 12 months, they have seriously contemplated suicide. And this is the highest rate of students contemplating suicide in the country. So the state of Indiana has more high school age students who are seriously contemplating suicide than any other state in the country. And so obviously this is, for those of you who are working with youth, those of you who are working with high school age youth, this is a huge concern. And this is something that as we move forward, as we talk about how can we address the needs of youth, and specifically the needs of youth related to mental health and suicide, we really have to keep in mind that we have a lot of high school students who are contemplating suicide. We have the highest number of high school aged youth who are contemplating suicide in the country. So just a few more kind of data slides for you all, because I think it's important to really know before we jump into what can we do. I think it's important to know why we're doing what we're doing. So this is back to United States data. This is a graph of the method by which folks in the United States died from suicide. And so the reason that I am showing you this particular graph is because I think it's important for folks to see that over half of all suicide deaths in 2018 in the United States were by firearm. And so I think what that tells us is that if an individual is suicidal and has access to a firearm, the chances that they will die from a firearm inflicted suicide go up dramatically. Now, that's not to say that simply owning a firearm will make a person suicidal, or that simply having access to a firearm will result in a suicide. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying, however, is that if an individual is suicidal and has access to a firearm, the chances that an individual will use that firearm in their suicide go up dramatically. And what we know is, unfortunately, firearms have the greatest risk of death because there's very little time to intervene. There's very little time to be able to prevent that suicide if a firearm is involved. So what I want you to really think about as you're kind of starting to think about how we do suicide prevention, and also how we do suicide prevention kind of digitally, I want you to really start to think about that idea of asking folks if they have access to a firearm, asking folks if there is a firearm in their home. I know that's kind of an uncomfortable question. I know that that's not something that we typically like to ask people about, but if you suspect that someone is suicidal, or if you suspect that someone is struggling with their mental health and maybe at some point having thoughts of suicide, it's important to know if they have access to a firearm. Not because you're going to go in and just take that firearm away from them, but because having access to that firearm increases their risk. And we're going to talk about risk factors here in just a couple of minutes. So just think about kind of asking the question of someone, do they have access to a firearm? Is there a firearm in their house? because the more that you get comfortable with asking that question, the more folks we're going to be able to protect if they find themselves in a place where they're thinking about suicide. So I'm going to pause here and just kind of do a quick check-in with Jess or with everyone. If there are any questions specifically related to data, sometimes people have specific questions before we jump into the risk factors. Are there any questions related to the data? Anything that people want to know more about related to the data? Okay. So it seems like perhaps folks are not don't have questions about the data, and that is just fine with me. Some of you have probably already glossed over, and that's okay too. Just come back. We'll get through this together. So just a few things to kind of think about as we are thinking about risk factors for folks related to suicide. You can see this great big list of things that are potentially risk factors. And so as you look at this, you probably will see folks that you work with, right? Whether they are folks who have mental health related issues, folks who are in the justice and child welfare settings. And something that I think that's important to note about that particular risk factor group is that often for those of us who are youth workers, we really think about the youth who are involved in justice and child welfare settings, right? So those youth who are incarcerated or those youth who have been removed from the home. And something that I think that's important to think about is also the impact that being involved in justice and child welfare settings has on the family, on the parents, that losing children through the child welfare system can be really difficult for the family as well. So even though we are youth workers, we know that we don't work in a vacuum, and that the families play such a huge role in the work that we do. So keep in mind that risk factors for justice and child welfare settings are not necessarily exclusively for the children, but also that the families have an increased risk if they are involved in the justice or child welfare settings, or if their children are involved in the justice or child welfare settings. Something else that I want to kind of point out in terms of risk factors are folks that self-injure. So often we will see people who self-injure as a coping skill. And something that's really kind of important to note about that is people often assume that individuals who self-injure are trying to end their lives. And I think what's important to remember about that is that's not always the case. In fact, that's actually rarely the case. What we know to be true instead is that people who self-injure have found a coping skill. Self-injury is their coping skill. So by cutting or burning, they are finding a way of managing that internal pain that they are feeling. This is really no different than folks who abuse alcohol or substances. They have found a coping skill. It's just not a healthy coping skill. So keep in mind that if you are seeing youth or individuals who self-injure, this does not necessarily mean that they are automatically suicidal. It does, however, mean that they are at greater risk of ending their life, simply because with self-injury, it requires a greater and greater amount of injury to achieve the same kind of level of relief. And so the risk in and of itself comes from the need to have that kind of greater and greater injury for relief.
Whitney, we
also,
actually had a question in
yes,
the chat box. Can you hear me?
I can.
Perfect. We actually had a question in the chat box from Cheryl, and she's asking why Indiana has some of the highest rates in the country. If you wouldn't mind explaining that briefly.
Sure. I don't have a definitive answer for you, unfortunately, but I can tell you that there are some statistics that kind of contribute to Indiana having some of the highest rates of youth thinking about suicide. So what we know, as you can see from kind of looking at this risk factor slide, is that rural youth tend to have a greater risk simply because they're more disconnected from other individuals, right? We know that people who live in rural areas may not have a ton of connection. They may not live around a lot of people. And so that connection, that lack of connection, can sometimes be a risk factor for folks. We also know that Indiana does not have the amount of mental health services that it needs. There are 19 counties currently in the state of Indiana that do not have a practicing psychiatrist, which means that about a quarter of all the counties in the state of Indiana are lacking a practicing psychiatrist, right? Someone who can prescribe prescription medications for mental health related issues. And so what ends up happening is that folks will often have to kind of drive a county over or 2 counties over to get access to a practicing psychiatrist. So that dramatically increases risk as well, because people are not able to get the services that they need. A couple of other things. One, the state of Indiana has pretty, we have pretty lax gun-related laws. And so there are a lot of firearms in the state of Indiana, which, again, right, this is not a commentary on gun ownership in any way, but what it is a statement that we know that if an individual is suicidal and has access to guns, their risk goes up. And so that also plays a role. And then the last thing that I think really plays a role is that currently in the state of Indiana, 75% of our youth who have been removed from the home due to neglect have a parent who has an opiate addiction. And so again, right, that creates additional risk for those youth because they are removed from the home, they're involved in child welfare, and they have a parent who has a substance use disorder. So I think all of those factors combined definitely contribute to Indiana having the highest rate of youth who are contemplating suicide in the country. Thank you for your question. Jess, are there any more questions?
Nope, that's it right now. Thank you.
Okay, great. So we're going to keep going with risk factors. So some other important kind of risk factors to think about, and I'm not going to read all of these to you, but just kind of keeping in mind that there are some things, not necessarily groups that individuals belong to, but things that have happened to them or things that are currently happening to them that play a role in their risk for suicide. So things like a previous suicide attempt or relationship problems. This says history of a mental health condition. It could also be current mental health condition, ongoing exposure to bullying behaviors, either in person or online. So again, just kind of thinking about how these risk factors play a role in an individual's risk for suicide. Some other high-risk circumstances, we've talked about access to lethal means. Lethal means also includes prescription medication. So as we are thinking about youth who are now home much more than they previously were, are they, do they have access to prescription medication? Is that something that we need to ask about? Is that something that we need to really think about in terms of, is that something that they could potentially have access to in the home? So the previous slide mentioned suicidal, a death by suicide. It's also important to note that any kind of suicidal behavior by a friend or a loved one, or even a celebrity, can play a role in an individual's risk. Self-harm behaviors, exposure to trauma, And then also the idea of feelings of worthlessness, isolation, loneliness. So again, you can see that there are a couple on here that are potentially high risk circumstances specifically related to COVID-19 and kind of the idea of this trauma and then subsequent loneliness and isolation that might be occurring as a result of the pandemic. What is important to note is that risk factors do not mean that a person is suicidal. And I think that this is really important to think about as you're thinking about the work that you're doing and how you're kind of translating that to a digital, virtual world. Just because you're seeing these risk factors does not mean that this is an individual who is suicidal. What risk factors do mean, however, is that this is a person who has a greater risk in the future for potentially being suicidal. So as you all are thinking about some of those risk factors that we just went through, please don't stress out about all of the youth that you're currently working with who have those risk factors. This is not to tell you that those are folks who you need to kind of worry about right this minute. But what you do need to think about in terms of those individuals who have risk factors for suicide is that they do have the potential to be at risk for suicide in the future. So some things that you want to do, you want to keep an eye out on for any changes in mood, any changes in behavior, any changes in language. So are you seeing a difference in the way that they're presenting, in a way that they're talking? You want to reach out regularly and provide support. So even if it's just a check-in, even if it's just letting them know that you are there to support them, we know that having that support actually reduces risk factors. So knowing that someone is there to support you, even if you're not currently suicidal, will actually reduce the risk of being suicidal in the future. So some of those risk factors that we talked about previously, one of the best ways to really protect someone and kind of help them to not be in a place where they're suicidal in the future is to try to reduce those risk factors as much as possible. So access to mental health care, support, treatment for mental health conditions, some of those kinds of things are risk factors that we can reduce. And then what we also want to do is increase protective factors. So we want to increase support. We want to increase access to care. We want to increase ability to use coping skills. Some of those kinds of things can really make a difference in terms of risk factors. We kind of talked about this, but 9 out of 10 people who die from suicide have a mental health condition that contributes to their death. So again, these are folks who have these risk factors. These are folks who are struggling with some of these mental health conditions. So keeping an eye on those as well. And then this idea that mental health is our ability to respond to challenges. So if you look at this little man, he has a protective bubble around him. And so the protective factors, so things like support, stability, access to mental health care, those are things that will protect him. And the hope is that even though he has those risk factors that we've discussed, those things that could potentially eat away at his bubble, the hope is that those protective factors will support him, protect him from those risk factors. And as youth workers, we really want to do what we can to reduce the risk factors and contribute to and support the protective factors. So then we're going to talk a little bit about warning signs. So risk factors are kind of things that people have, things that people are carrying with them that contribute to their risk in the future. Warning signs are those things that tell us that an individual is currently suicidal. So you can see from this that things like substance use is a warning sign. Feelings of isolation or choosing to isolate oneself is a warning sign. dramatic changes in mood or behavior, talking about death or talking about suicide, feeling hopeless or talking about not having any hope. So these are all warning signs. And so with risk factors, right, we want to support folks and we want to protect folks. With warning signs, we need to step in. We need to really take some action in making sure that the folks that we are working with are safe. So this just kind of breaks it down into 3 categories. So the way that folks talk, the behavior that folks are exhibiting, and then also the mood that people have. So you can see that if an individual is talking about killing themselves, or talking about suicide, talking about feeling hopeless or not having any reason to live, talking about being a burden to others or feeling like they are trapped with no way out. So these are all kind of things that people talk about that are warning signs. So if you hear these, right, if you're hearing these in folks, those are warning signs and they're a thing, and we need to kind of step in and address those. For the behavior, right, you can see drug and alcohol use, withdrawing from activities, excessive fatigue, aggression, and then also you can see mood, depression, anxiety, irritability. So one of the things that I also want to kind of point out is that these can be difficult, especially during this period, because I am certain that I have felt excessive fatigue during this stay-at-home order. I have felt irritability and anxiety. So really keep in mind that what we're looking for are, risk factors paired with warning signs, and then really feeling like we can reach out and ask about those warning signs and see what we can do. So what's important to note in terms of suicide is that it doesn't really happen out of the blue like people often think. Sometimes it does, but usually what happens is something that kind of looks like this graph. So you can see on the left are the gray arrows, and these are kind of the fundamental risk factors that we carry around with us all the time. So biological risk factors, that's going to be something like a predisposition to anxiety or depression that we got in our genetics from our parents, because we know that those things have a biological genetic predisposition. Personal psychological risk factors are going to be things like frustration tolerance or ability to develop coping skills. Also, this might be the development of an anxiety disorder that is not related to neurotransmitters. And then environment, right? So this one is a big one to think about right now in terms of the pandemic and how we address that, because we know that environment can play a huge role, especially for the youth that we're working with. And so thinking about our youth who maybe are stuck at home, maybe they're stuck at home with an abusive parent, maybe they're stuck in a neglectful home, maybe they're stuck in a home where the people around them are really struggling with the stress and anxiety related to the pandemic. That's a risk factor in and of itself for them. So keep an eye on those risk factors, because then what we often see is that people carry those around with them all the time, and so they get used to what that feels like. But then they often will have kind of these proximal risk factors, or things that we refer to as like the final straw, the trigger. So again, that could be an illness or a major loss. And these are usually the things that we point to when we say, like, this is why someone attempted suicide, or this is why someone died from suicide. But keeping in mind that those risk factors really kind of fill up a lot of space, and then those triggers or those final straws are kind of that last thing that pushes someone to a place where they feel hopeless or helpless and are thinking about suicide. So for most of us, we have all gotten to a place where we feel really stressed out, where we feel like, we don't know what we're going to do. We feel really overwhelmed. And so when that happens, usually what we do is we run into this kind of wall of resistance, which is our protective factors. And so we talked a little bit about protective factors earlier, but those protective factors are really what keeps us safe. It's really what protects us when we end up in a place where we're thinking about, you know, being overwhelmed, feeling hopeless. And so for the individuals that we're working with, if they get to a place where they're feeling hopeless and helpless, that wall of resistance is often very minimal, because what we know is that the more risk factors that an individual has, those risk factors tend to kind of tear away at protective factors. So you can see here that there are lots of things that can be used as protective factors. And looking at this, many of these are things that don't necessarily require being able to leave the house, being able to engage in routine. So really thinking about how can we, during this period of time, support developing or support increasing those protective factors in others. How can we help folks with positive self-esteem? How can we help folks with a sense of hope or a calm environment? So knowing that those are things that are protective factors that really can keep folks safe during some of this very stressful time. So am I safe? There is a woman named Dr. Jill Bolte-Taylor, and she is a neuroanatomist, and she actually talks a lot about the brain. And one of the things that she really focuses on is the idea of the amygdala. And so the amygdala lives way deep down in the center of your brain, and its primary function is to constantly scan the environment and determine if you're safe. So right now, during this time of pandemic and uncertainty and anxiety, our amygdalas are scanning the environment, looking for safety, looking for security. And for a lot of people, the amygdala is not finding safety and security. What it's finding is additional questions. What it's finding is additional stress. What it's finding is lots and lots of bad news with no really good answers. And so what happens with the amygdala is that it gets really, really agitated. And when it gets agitated, think about a small child. And when that small child gets agitated, they agitate everyone else around them. And that's really what happens to the amygdala. So the amygdala agitates everyone around it. And one of the things that's around it is the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is what controls memory. So when the amygdala scans the environment and says, am I safe? It then agitates if it doesn't feel safe, it then agitates the hippocampus. And the hippocampus forgets what it's supposed to do, right? So when we are struggling with the folks that we're working with to remember coping skills, to remember how to care for themselves, to remember all the things that they need to do, all the things that they've learned, it's important to note that they aren't being difficult, that they really are struggling to remember because they don't feel safe. So what do we really need to think about in terms of how our current situation, how the quarantine, how social distancing, how the pandemic is impacting our ability to do suicide care and suicide risk of the individuals that we work with? So social distancing may trigger those folks who currently have suicidal thoughts, right? So if they're currently thinking that they feel alone, that they feel isolated, and then they are physically forced to feel alone, to be alone and to be isolated, that could increase risk. So if this is an individual who's already struggling with these things, this is an important thing to keep in mind. One of the other things that our current situation does to impact suicide risk is that we don't know kind of what the social and economic fallout from the pandemic is going to be. We do know that there are a lot of people who are not currently working, which causes some economic stress on people in the immediate But what we also know is that there will likely be some fallout economically down the road. And so folks that are experiencing current stress because of economic fallout may also be worried about the potential for economic fallout down the road. We know that anxiety is fear of the unknown, fear of the unexpected. And right now we are living kind of in a very unknown, unexpected situation. And so those folks who already have anxiety are struggling with not knowing what to do from day to day. They're struggling with, you know, kind of how to manage that anxiety. And then it's also important to note that there might be differences in suicidal responses. So for those folks whose kind of suicidal thoughts are related more to self-esteem, they may not be impacted by the current situation. In fact, they might actually feel a sense of camaraderie with the people around them, with their friends and family who are also going through some of the same quarantine, social distancing, and anxiety that they are. However, folks whose suicidal thoughts and anxiety are specifically related to things like catastrophic thinking, they might actually have a greater suicidal response due to that idea of catastrophic thinking and not knowing how to be able to control what's going on in the future, or their being able to control kind of their environment. Some risk factors that are specific to our current situation: mental health deterioration, right? So we know that folks who have anxiety, folks who are struggling with some of the unknown, this could be really, really difficult for their mental health because there is so much uncertainty. There is such a potentially long-lasting nature, and not knowing exactly when this is going to end and when things are going to go back to normal. Oh no, I don't know how to go back. Okay. Disruption in routines, right? We all are experiencing this. The disruption in the routine for folks that really rely on routines to be a protective factor for them, this can be difficult. Access to care. So this one is really interesting because access to care for folks who are going in and seeing a mental health professional, who were getting access to care through a psychiatrist, not being able to have access to care could really be difficult for them. But also, this could be a protective factor for some folks because a lot of people are switching to telehealth. And so that access to care could actually be increased for some people. Okay. So what can you do to help? Well, there are a few things that you can do. Really thinking about suicide as collaborative, right? So one of the things that we really have to think about in terms of this kind of system that we are all currently working in is the idea that we have to work together. We no longer can work individually to address mental health related issues in the folks that we are working with. So we really have to think about how we're doing this as a system, and working with folks to ensure that we have the right things in place for the folks that we're working with. So doing things collaboratively with the individual that we're working with, making sure that we are using standardized screenings and assessments, making sure that we are working to improve folks' understanding of how suicide risk plays a role in people's mental health. So really looking at this from a much broader picture is going to be how we address what we are working with in this current system. So the first thing that you can do is start the conversation, right? So I think so often we get uncomfortable in talking with people about this particularly. And I think also sometimes we get uncomfortable when we are not there individually with the person to be able to say, if you need to go to the hospital, I will take you to the hospital. But in this current situation that we have with the pandemic and with social isolation, we really need to be able to have these conversations and know that just having the conversation and being able to provide support and resources can be really, really effective for folks. Not everyone who says that they are having thoughts of suicide needs to go to the hospital. And so we need to really start thinking about, during the social distancing, how we ask these questions and how we have these conversations with people, because we can't avoid the conversations because we don't know what to do if a person says yes. So starting those conversations, talking to people, letting them tell their stories, asking specifically about suicide, right? Saying, are you having thoughts of suicide? And then sharing resources, asking this individual what they need in terms of being able to stay safe. So in terms of specifically the pandemic, one of the things that we really need to focus on is helping folks to determine what is in their control. So much of the anxiety that folks are currently experiencing is related to things that are not within their control. And so as you are talking to folks in the midst of a pandemic, really think about helping them to identify some of those things that are causing them anxiety, some of those things that are causing them stress, and then helping them to determine if those things are within their control or if those things are not within their control. And if they're not within their control, helping them to see that there's not anything that they can do about that. So things like if other people are social distancing, if other people are doing the things that they're supposed to be doing, we don't have any control over that. And so helping individuals to see that not focusing on the things that we don't have control over is actually a very healthy thing. And then also helping them to determine what makes them feel safe. So I know for some of us, we spend kind of a lot of time figuring out what we want to do, what we need to do, what makes us feel relaxed, what makes us feel happy. And so for the folks that are at risk of suicide and have mental health related issues, helping them to determine what makes them feel safe. Does developing a routine where they have a schedule, even if they're at home, does that make them feel safe? Checking in with loved ones, checking in with you as a youth care worker, does that make them feel safe? So helping them to determine what they need in their current environment that makes them feel safe. And then also challenging them to stay focused on the present. And I think this is something that we all really need to think about. It's really, really easy to get wrapped up in the news. It's really, really easy to get wrapped up in social media. Right now, especially during social isolation, we start to feel like maybe social media is all we have. We start to feel like maybe that connection to the world is digital. But also realizing that spending all of our time on social media focused on the what ifs and the what happened yesterday or the what is happening in Italy can really cause a strain on our mental health. So focusing on the present, focusing on what is happening right now to us, and maybe setting some boundaries around social media, maybe setting some boundaries around exposure to news will help us and help the folks that we're working with to stay focused on what is going on in the present and staying connected. Remind folks to do the things that keep them healthy. So I know that this maybe sounds kind of silly, but please remember that we are currently in a state where we're teaching people how to wash their hands. So remember that the amygdala causes the hippocampus to forget what it's doing. And so we may need to remind people to drink water. We may need to remind people to go out and take a walk, or to go outside and stand in the sunshine. We may need to remind people to do those things that keep them healthy. And then also we need to help people to move forward. So not getting stuck in what has happened, not getting stuck in things that we can't control, but looking forward, reminding people that we will get through this, that there is light at the end of the tunnel. And while we don't know what that looks like, that we really do need to move forward in terms of our own mental health and progress. One of the easy things that you all can do, so from a social distancing perspective, to keep folks safe is safety planning. So this is a safety plan template that was developed by Stanley and Brown. It's really easily accessible on the internet. You can Google it and print it off. But what you can do is via video conferencing, via a phone call, you can talk to the youth that you're working with, the individuals that you're working with, and go through this safety plan. And then once it's filled out, you can email it to them. You can have them fill it out with you so they have a copy of it. But the idea behind a safety plan is that when an individual, you can see at the top, it starts with warning signs. So this is to really, again, when the amygdala starts to go crazy and makes the rest of the brain forget what it's supposed to be doing, this reminds an individual that when I see these warning signs, things are potentially increasing in risk for me. So when I see these warning signs, what am I going to do? So you can see that step 2 is things I can do to take my mind off my problems, right? So this is really nice. Often what I do is I have people fill this out with me and then put it on their refrigerator, or put it someplace where they see it often, because what we want is for when people are really struggling, that they can grab this and they're not relying on their hippocampus. They're not relying on their memory to remind them of what they're supposed to do when they start to get stressed out, but that they have it written down in front of them. And you'll also see that all the way down at the bottom is step 5, which is professionals and agencies I can contact. That means that there are 4 steps prior to that. What we are hoping is that folks will be able to kind of work through those 4 steps on their own, so that you are not the first call, but that you are, that 5th step when folks feel like they have kind of worked through all of the other options that they have in their safety plan and need you to kind of help them. So this is a really easy thing that you can do with the individuals that you're working with to help develop a very black and white, very concrete way for them to manage some of their own stressors and potentially thoughts of suicide. So just a few other resources for everyone to be aware of. Look up Indiana is a really great resource that covers the entire state of Indiana, and it provides resources related not specifically just to mental health, but all kinds of different resources that an individual might need. So again, if we are talking about how do we help a person to feel safe, how do we help a person to feel supported, one of the things that we can do is use this resource or give this resource to the folks that we're working with, so that they can look up their own resources. Perhaps it is energy assistance. Perhaps it is how do I get no cost clothing? How do I get access to digital resources for school? And Look Up Indiana has a lot of really great resources that a person can access digitally. And then there are also some resources that are specific to suicide prevention that are digital. So these are all smartphone apps that are accessible in the App Store, both for Android and iPhone. All of these apps are no cost. And so the Jason Foundation is really great because it's for like youth who maybe want to talk to a friend but don't know how. So it gives very specific tips for this is what you can say or do. Safer Home is really wonderful because it helps parents to figure out how to make their house safe. If they have a youth living in their house, or if they have someone living in their house who is at risk of suicide, it kind of goes through how do you lock up firearms? How do you lock up and or dispose of prescription medications? So I know often when we're working with parents, they feel like they don't know what to do if their youth is at risk for suicide or having suicidal thoughts. And Safer Home is a really nice, it's a really nice app for that. Life Buoy is great for an individual who is struggling and needs to kind of be maintained in their mental health. It has a mood app it has a kind of a mood feature where they can write in a diary, they can use emojis to express their mood, and then they can share that with others via email. So again, in this digital world, that's a really nice way of being able to stay in contact. It might be something that you build in when you're talking to folks about how do they stay safe. What are things that they can do to stay safe? Maybe it's writing in the Life Buoy journal and then sending it to you. And then Virtual Hope Box is another one that I really like. So this is great for people who maybe are not currently suicidal, but maybe they're struggling with mental health and just need something to kind of help keep them on track. So this has games, it has guided meditation, it has quotes. So it has a lot of really great mental health related stuff that folks can use independently to kind of take control of their own mental health and feelings. And then Suicide Lifeguard down here is really great as well. It has, it's a little bit more for like if somebody is at risk right now, so how to get help, what are some warning signs. So again, just some digital resources that you can suggest that the youth that you're working with download on their phone, or the parents download on their phone, or you could even put them on your phone. But they're just some really nice digital resources to have while we are doing social distancing. Some additional resources, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, which is a 24/7 staffed crisis hotline. It's also, we call it a crisis hotline, and also you can call it for resources. So if if you need some additional resources, you can call that number and they can share with you resources depending on your location. If you have folks who don't feel comfortable calling and they want to text, they can text the National Crisis Text Line, which is 741-741. So if they text the letters IN for Indiana to 741-741, that will initiate a crisis text conversation. So maybe for those youth who are at home with their parents and need somebody to talk to, they can do that kind of quietly. HaveHope.com is a nice resource that has inspirational videos. It has some great resources for parents, for teachers, for youth. And then the IN.gov website, which is the Indiana Suicide Prevention website, has some resources specific to the state of Indiana that can be accessed as well. So this is my contact information. And now I am going to open it up for questions. So Jess, do we have any questions?
Not that we haven't already answered. So if anybody does have a question, they're either welcome to ask it in the chat box or unmute themselves and ask it now. But right now, I think we've answered all of the questions in the chat box.
Okay. So if anybody has any questions about anything that we discussed, please feel free to type it in the chat box, or if you want to unmute yourselves and ask it in real time, you're also more than welcome to do that. And I know if you're like me, if you think about something that you wanted to ask later, after all of this information has sunk in, please feel free to email me or call me with your specific questions. I'm happy to answer any questions or provide any of those resources that you just saw. So please feel free to reach out if you need to. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Whitney, will these slides be available to access?
They will. They will be on, Robin, correct me if I'm wrong, they will be available on the IYSA website.
We have a IYSA, and you do have to type in Indiana Youth Service Association. When you go to YouTube, we have a YouTube training channel because we are recording this. That link will be on the training channel, and we will also send this out the same way that we sent out the notification for the live webinar so that folks have access to that as well. The resource guide that I mentioned in the chat feature will also have the link to the recorded session, and that will be on the IYSA website. All right. Well, it doesn't look like there are any other questions. I want to say thank you to Whitney and to Jess for monitoring the chat feature. Whitney, for your presentation and the very, very important information. Hope that everyone found this helpful and everyone is staying safe and staying sane as we practice our staying at home and social distancing. And again, I'll just kind of reiterate, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out and let us know. We're happy to help. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Hey, is it too late to ask a question?
Nope, ask a question.
I guess, is there any helpful hints or thoughts of the students we seem to be having the most problem with don't have access to internet, and I'm getting, clearly that's increasing kind of their, their loneliness and social time. So any thoughts or hints for that?
Yeah, so I don't know, are you finding that the students do they have phones? Do they have a platform in which they could have internet? I only ask because I know that like there are several, AT&T and Verizon both had put out some information that they were offering free internet for those students who were doing homeschooling now that were impacted by the pandemic. So I know that there are some folks out there who are offering free internet, but obviously it would require that they have some sort of device on which to access that.
I was going to say, I know the schools have sent out a lot of the info around here about access to the free internet and such. And, for whatever reason, maybe they don't have a device or anything. I don't know actually, because I can't see them.
Right.
But we have a significant number of students not taking advantage. So at this time, no internet. They do have a phone, but no internet.
That was the question I was going to ask. If they have a phone, then certainly calling and checking in that way, just so that they know. I mean, Whitney made a really good point that if they know that there's someone out there who is concerned about them, that they can reach out to by phone, that will make a big difference.
Okay. Thanks so much. I mean,
That
that's
would be
currently
my
what. Thank you.
All right.
I know that's not the best suggestion, and I'm sorry I don't have a better answer for you, but I mean, I think any way that you can stay connected, especially for those youth who are high risk, the better it's going to be for them, because they did lose that connectedness from school. They did lose that support from school. So, I think any way that we can find to still stay connected virtually, whether it's phone calls or emails or text messages or anything, is going to be better than nothing.
Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for your question.
All right. All right. Goodbye, everyone. Thanks so much.